Well, good morning. Welcome to Standards Plus History Academy. We are beginning episode 21 today. I uh, I think this is a very crucial episode topic today in the investigation or research into JFK assassination because it proves, in my mind anyway, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the CIA and the FBI were involved in manufacturing evidence and involving Lee Harvey Oswald. And that's the general topic we've been discussing recently is Lee Harvey Oswald. First, before I begin, I want to thank you for all your comments. Um, a lot of them positive, some of them not so much, but uh, I welcome all comments. In all my years of researching this topic, I've never come across any JFK researcher who could claim that they were the final repository on all things truth when it concerns the JFK assassination. There's just too much information. There's too many details. And it's so easy to get a detail here wrong or there wrong. And I have found most JFK researchers are very, uh, that their intentions are good and they're not trying to mislead anybody. So, and that would include me as well. So if I get a detail wrong here or there, please extend a little grace. I am constantly changing my mind about things. Uh, in fact, this topic we're going to talk about today, in the last 25 years, I've changed my mind 3 times about this Mexico City saga. 3 times. And every time time goes by, you learn more and your view changes on things. And since there's no one out there that knows everything, the way we learn is from each other. Because somebody's an expert in this area, someone else is an expert in that area. And when the dialogue occurs, well, we learn from each other. And that's really what I'm trying to create here. It's just a dialogue where we all learn from each other and push the ball a little further towards the end zone when it comes to truth. So again, keep the comments coming. And if you know something that you can add to the particular episode, please feel free. Feel free to share. I respond to as many as I can. I've noticed that my notifications that I get uh, are sometimes lag, sometimes they don't happen at all. And I get on my laptop and I find that there's been some comments that didn't show up on my phone or vice versa. So sometimes there's a gap there. But anyway, I read them for sure. And I try to respond to the ones that I can. Um, if you care to check out my website at standardsplushistoryacademy.com, as I've said before, I am a high school history teacher, certified in U.S. history, world history, and government. And I offer those 3 subjects, all the curriculum for homeschool students or anybody else who wants it, teachers perhaps. You can purchase those through my website, or if you want me as a online teacher for your son or daughter, I'm available for that as well. There's 2 different options. You can buy the curriculum or you can buy me, essentially. I also offer a 4th class, which is the JFK assassination. It's an elective that's open to anybody. So my books are on there. I have podcasts. I'm always doing podcasts, and there's a few blogs on there. I need to update that, add some more to another blog. But anyway, that website is available. So on to today's topic. And the question is, why did the CIA lie about Oswald and his trip to Mexico City? I'm going to go ahead and stipulate that he made a trip to Mexico City, even though I don't believe. I've gone through several dispensations of this. At first, I thought he did make a trip because I trusted the CIA and the FBI to tell me the truth about it. Then I realized that he couldn't have, because I realized that the CIA and the FBI was lying and the evidence didn't support it, the timeline and some sightings in Dallas. And now I'm back to thinking that he did. And I won't be able to fully support that assertion until we talk about medical Manhattan. When we cover that topic, that will help explain why I believe Oswald was indeed in Mexico City, but not for the purposes that the CIA and FBI think or say. In fact, the story that we're going to talk about today is their concoction to frame him, to contribute more to material to the cover story, to implicate him, to incriminate him. But the story has a side purpose too, and that's to cover up something that they don't want the American people to know. So I'll start with that. These are photos of whom the CIA says is Lee Harvey Oswald coming and going from the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. They have surveillance cameras set up at the entrance, and this man went in and signed in as Lee Harvey Oswald at the Cuban embassy. So you just using your eyes, you can look at these three pictures and conclude definitively none of these are Lee Harvey Oswald. And yet the CIA gave these photographs to the Warren Commission as proof that Oswald had made a trip to Mexico City. So, and of course, this man did sign in using Lee Harvey Oswald's name. Now, we are beginning in episode 22. We're going to begin talking about the Oswald doppelgangers. And this is not the first time someone is using his name, and it won't be the last. This is a part of a continuing and ongoing part of the cover story, the creation of the cover story, the sheep dipping of Oswald. But so what this shows is that the CIA is willing to use photographs of someone who is clearly not Oswald to say that it is Oswald. In other words, they're manufacturing evidence because the CIA is not dumb. They can look at those photos the same as you and I can and see that that's not Oswald. But somebody thinks it's important to have him in Mexico City signing in at the Cuban embassy. And since the CIA is the one that started this whole story, through their disinformation chief, who's located in Mexico City, David Atlee Phillips, it's clear to me, anyway, that the CIA concocted this whole story. So that's those three famous photographs. Here they are again. Make my face a little smaller. Okay. So we're back to the timeline. Remember now, last we talked, Oswald has disappeared for much of the month of September, at least as far as the public is concerned. There's no obvious sightings. And when I say obvious sightings, all the sightings in the summer were obvious because Oswald made them obvious. That was his job. And then all of a sudden he goes dark for the most of the month of September. Now we know because of what Judith Very wrote in her book and has said in countless interviews that he didn't go dark completely. He was with her. And because they realized their time was running short, they spent the entire month of September on Carlos Marcello's dime, living it up in New Orleans. And the only people who really were privy to that were close associates, and all of them ended up dead. So it's hard to corroborate Judith Very's story, but it sure does make sense because there are no sightings, and this guy was out and about every day until all of a sudden he wasn't. And so we're now to September 27 and 28, where he reappears. And he reappears in Mexico City, and the CIA and the FBI. Now, the CIA is going to put out this story. And the FBI, when the story starts getting muddied up and problematic, the FBI is going to come behind and try to buttress the story. That's the role the FBI plays in this. So let's just focus on the CIA for now. According to the CIA and the evidence that they're going to release, Oswald is in Mexico City, allegedly planning the assassination and arranging for his post-assassination getaway. So they publish these images and they say, this is him. This is proof that he's in Mexico City. He's entering and exiting two different embassies, the Cuban and the Soviet embassies. And as I said, we have those under surveillance. The CIA also claims that his recorded phone calls, which of course they have bugs on the phone lines in these embassies. And so they say they have recordings of these phone calls from Oswald to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. And in one call, now remember, this is the CIA's version. This is the story that the CIA is telling. They allege that Oswald, in one of these phone conversations, refers to an earlier meeting he had with Valery Kostikov. Valery Kostikov is a well-known KGB agent whose specialty is sabotage and assassination. He works for the KGB's Department 13. Everybody knows who he is. This isn't a mysterious guy. But what's important about this is what his specialty is: assassination. And so it's clear what the CIA is trying to do. They're painting a picture of premeditation, that Oswald is meeting with an assassination expert in Mexico City at the end of September. And then, of course, 2 months later, he's going to assassinate the American president. And of course, the two embassies that he's visiting, Cuban and the Soviet, are both communist. So, and he's meeting with a well-known KGB agent. So that means Oswald is acting on behalf of these two communist countries and the KGB, and they are helping him carry out an assassination on the American president. And because he's there trying to get a passport from Cuba, which then will lead to a passport to Russia, he's arranging for himself to have a post-assassination getaway. This is the story they're going to drop on the American people. Okay. Now, Oswald gets arrested and the FBI interrogates him. And when they compare those recordings that the CIA claims is Oswald to the voice that they heard when they interrogated him for hours and hours at Dallas Police Headquarters, the result is they realize the voices are not a match. And of course, this is problematic for the CIA, who's saying that this is Oswald. And so later, when the investigators, such as the House Select Committee, want to hear the tapes for themselves, the CIA says, well, they've disappeared. This is a familiar pattern. Evidence that is claimed to incriminate and does incriminate Oswald significantly early on disappears later when it's requested to be produced. They said all they have left are the transcripts. And of course, you can't match somebody's voice with a written transcript. How convenient. The FBI director recognized the problem right away, as he mentions this in a conversation with LBJ in the White House. Actually, it's on a phone call. And he also puts it in a memo, and he states it clearly. Quote, Oswald's voice was not recorded by the CIA in Mexico City. All 7 FBI agents who are familiar with the sound of Oswald's voice agree it is not Oswald. So the story's falling apart. The photos don't match Oswald. The voice recordings don't match Oswald, yet the CIA says it was Oswald because the man who signed in used Oswald's name. Well, maybe immediately after the assassination, that might ring true. But then later, as we start to find out that there's doppelgangers all over Dallas, and there's somebody using Oswald's name years earlier, enough to attract the attention of J. Edgar Hoover, anyway, who cites it in a memo of his, you start to understand that guy down in Mexico City, who the CIA says is Lee Harvey Oswald, is not Oswald. It's a plant. He's part of this ongoing doppelganger campaign to lay a trail. It leads right back to Oswald. When the story starts to fall apart, the man who concocted the story, who was in charge of this information and in charge of the CIA's Western Hemisphere office, David Atlee Phillips, says later in an interview, quote, I will tell you this. Actually, he was giving a presentation. He was asked this question about Mexico City. And in his response, he says, quote, I will tell you this, that when the record comes out, we will find that there was never a photograph taken of Oswald in Mexico City. We will find out that Oswald never visited there. There is no evidence, first of all, no proof of that. Secondly, there is no evidence to show that Oswald ever visited the Soviet embassy. The story fell apart so completely that now the CIA is put in a position where they have to disavow that he ever went to Mexico City at all, because the whole purpose of this story was to lay an incriminating trail leading back to Oswald. Well, that fell apart. And the reason I believe he actually did go to Mexico City, but for other reasons that the CIA doesn't want revealed, the reason I believe that is because of the statement by David Atlee Phillips. Not only this statement, but this contributes to it. David Atlee Phillips doesn't know how to say the truth in any situation. That's why he's the disinformation chief of the CIA. And anything he says relating to Oswald or the CIA, I just have learned to assume that he's telling a lie. So when at first he says Oswald was there, and then the evidence doesn't support it, in fact, contradicts it, and then he comes back and says, no, he wasn't there at all. I believe he was there, and they don't want anyone to investigate it further and know the reason why he was there. So they're gonna own the mistake and hope that no one follows up to discover the real reason Oswald was in Mexico City. But we'll like I said, we'll cover that later. So this just shows that the CIA is trying to cover its own, you know what. This story at Fenella Farrington is where the FBI gets implicated in this whole thing, because at this point, the FBI realizes the CIA story is falling apart. They really need this story to add to the legend of Oswald, and so they literally try to manufacture evidence. There was a woman, her name is Fenella Farrington. She had legitimately visited the Mexican consulate in New Orleans, September of 1963, about the same time Oswald had gone dark. And she was trying to arrange for her car to be returned from Mexico. Evidently, her family had been there and they'd left their car. And anyway, long story. But 4 days after the assassination, the FBI tracked her down. Turns out she lives in Washington, D.C. And they found her because she'd been photographed at the consulate in New Orleans, and she was talking with Oswald. And so Oswald was at this Mexican consulate in New Orleans, and just one of these random things that happens between the two. And so because they were trailing Oswald, they got her in a photograph. So they tracked her down, found her in Washington, D.C., and they want to know her relationship with Oswald. She didn't have a relationship with Oswald. She just bumped into him and she says she didn't even remember the conversation, but she certainly didn't have a relationship with him. So the FBI tried to coerce a statement from Farrington admitting that she met Oswald in New Orleans because she had earlier met him in Mexico City. And this was an ongoing relationship, and it started in Mexico City. Farrington says that's not true. I never met a Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City. I don't know this man. If you have a photograph of me speaking with him, I spoke with a lot of people at the Mexican consulate in New Orleans. I was there trying to arrange for my car to be returned from Mexico. I don't remember the conversation you're talking about. Here's the photograph. That's me, but it's not somebody I know. And I certainly didn't meet this guy in Mexico City. So what they're trying to do is add a layer of corroboration to this CIA concocted Mexico City story. And Fenella Farrington is the vehicle by which they're going to try to do this. The problem was Fenella Farrington came out, went public, and said, this is all bogus. But what this shows is that the FBI is willing to make up something, and they're trying to coerce her to go along with this agenda, and she won't do it. She didn't play along. She didn't play ball. Why this is significant, especially, is because the Warren Commission was not technically an investigative body. It didn't gather its own evidence. All they did, they relied on the FBI for all their evidence. So whatever evidence came across the desk of the Warren Commission was evidence provided it by the FBI. So the FBI was in a position to control what information, what evidence the Warren Commission saw and what evidence the Warren Commission did not see. This shows that the FBI is willing to manufacture evidence to implicate Oswald. Now remember, the Warren Commission was starting with the conclusion that Oswald was guilty and then I work backwards. This would have been really handy evidence from Fenella Farrington to show that Oswald was in Mexico City when the CIA said he was there. And so it's not just the CIA say so that he was there, and those photographs, which make no sense, and those recordings, which don't match, they at least have Fenella Farrington's story, but now they don't. And so you have two government agencies trying to implicate Oswald, trying to play basically judge and jury, and they're planting evidence. Okay. Then you have this Sylvia Odio story pictured here on the left. She lives in Dallas, and she claims, she told the Warren Commission this, she claims that three men, according to her, two Latins and a gringo, had visited her in Dallas in late September 1963, which is about the same time the Warren Commission and the CIA and now the FBI saying that Oswald is in Mexico City. And they knocked on her door and they were looking for help regarding a letter that they were trying to solicit funds for a Cuban exile organization called JUR. They picked her apartment because Odio had a famous daddy. Her daddy was a prominent political prisoner in Cuba. So they figured, and she came from money. So they figured they could raise some money through Sylvia Odio because of what had happened to her daddy. This is all about getting Castro out, overthrowing the Cuban government, etc. While she was talking to them, the two Latins introduced themselves as Leopoldo and Angelo, or Angel. Now, I told you a couple episodes ago when to remember the name Angel, when Oswald was distributing leaflets on Canal Street, downtown New Orleans, there was a photo taken, and one of the guys in the photo handing out literature with Oswald was a Latin named Angel Cruz, actually. And so here he is again. This guy appears and disappears, and he's with Oswald in different places. So he's obviously part of the sheep dipping operation. So they introduced the two Latins as Leopoldo and Angelo, or Angel. And they introduced the white guy, whom they call a gringo, as, quote, Leon Oswald. All right. Now, she has no reason to remember this or for it to stand out in her memory. She says, but the next day, Leopoldo called her and wanted to talk about Leon Oswald, the gringo that was with him. And just sort of unsolicited, he just starts offering information about this Leon Oswald. He says, well, he's an ex-Marine. He's an excellent shot. He's trustworthy. He's as much part of the cause as we are, even though he's not Cuban. In fact, he says JFK should have been assassinated after the Bay of Pigs. He's crazy. He's more extreme than we are even. And, she'd never met these 2 days prior. She'd never met these people. She didn't know who they were. Now she's had these two conversations with them, and it was odd. Well, 2 months later, JFK was murdered in Dallas. And of course, Oswald gets arrested, and his photograph is in the newspaper and on television. And she recognizes the guy. She says, oh my God, that's the guy that was on my doorstep. That's the guy they were talking about, Leon Oswald. That's the gringo. And so she goes down to the FBI. She reports the story and eventually testifies to the Warren Commission. Now, it wasn't just Sylvia Odio. Her sister lived with her, and Annie came to the door and stood there, allegedly, with Sylvia as this conversation took place. And so she was also present. She also saw this gringo named Leon Oswald. Now, the Warren Commission has a problem because the timeline doesn't work. The late September dates that she gives are exactly the same time that the Warren Commission is trying to prove, based on what the CIA and FBI is telling them, that Oswald was in Mexico City. So how can he be two places at once? And now later in the House Select Committee investigation in the late 70s, they accepted Odio's story because by this point, we've learned that doppelgangers make it possible for the same guy to be in two places at once. Not literally the same person, but you understand my point. And by this point, the Mexico City story has fallen apart to such a degree that the House Select Committee doesn't even believe he ever was in Mexico City. And so they accept the Odio story. So we have a situation where the early investigation doesn't accept her story, basically calling her a liar. And the second investigation, these are both government investigations, the second investigation accepts her story. So we got an issue here. Clearly, this is going back to the question: why would the CIA lie about this? Why would the FBI back it up? Well, the CIA is the one I want to focus on because they're the ones who came up with this, and the FBI is just trying to, make sure all their ducks in a row and prove it to be true. Well, this is Oswald needs to be shown in Mexico City, trying to go to Cuba. That makes him essentially a Castro asset. He is there doing the bidding. If Cuba is going to let him into Cuba, if they're going to give him a passport, and this is admittedly after a whole summer of acting pro-Castro and running the Fair Play for Cuba committee, still though, you have to assume that the Cuban intelligence agents, apparatus is smart enough to know when someone's faking and when not. And certainly the Soviets, I mean, he's already been to Russia once, and now they know he's a fake defector. Why would he be visiting the Soviet embassy? Why would he think that he could get into the Soviet Union a second time? Anyway, the whole point is try to go to Cuba after he assassinates the American president, after he meets with an assassination expert at the Cuban embassy or the Soviet embassy, whichever. So he is essentially a Castro asset. He's plotting to kill JFK because he was a communist. He's laid that groundwork. I mean, he's claimed to be a Marxist-Leninist. He claims to be pro-Castro. He went to Russia. He married a Russian woman. He was going to renounce his American. I mean, he's been sheep-dipped as a communist ever since he got into the military, even before. So that's not going to be a hard sell. The Kostikov meeting is going to tie him to assassination. The Cuban passport is going to show premeditation and post-assassination getaway plans. He's either going to go to Cuba or Russia, most likely Cuba. If he went to Cuba, came back, if they can show that he went to Mexico City, get a passport to Cuba, went to Cuba, and then came back and assassinated JFK, the American people, it's not going to be a leap. It's not going to be that hard to convince the American people that Oswald acted on behalf of Castro to kill our American president, and it would support an invasion of Cuba. This is what we call a false flag operation. Later, I'm going to talk about Operation Northwoods, and Operation Northwoods was famously a false flag operation that was proposed to Kennedy, whereby American targets, prominent American target, would be targeted for some sort of an attack, and it would be blamed or laid at the feet of Castro so that the American people would justify or okay an invasion into Cuba. Remember now, there's people in the CIA and in the military that are furious with Kennedy because he didn't follow up in Bay of Pigs, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, which they viewed as a do-over opportunity for the Bay of Pigs. He didn't invade, he didn't bomb the missile sites, and so Castro is still in power. The Cuban government is still communist, and they blame Kennedy for it. And so they're trying to figure out a way to get the American people riled up to pressure Kennedy to okay an invasion into Cuba. That's why they proposed this Northwoods operation. We'll talk about it. It's crazy. And Kennedy said, no way, we're not doing any of that. We're not targeting American targets. Well, I believe they went ahead with this operation anyway, and without him proving it. And there's all kinds of evidence, the CIA doing all kinds of things they were told by Kennedy not to do. They did it anyway. So why would this be any different? And the prominent American target becomes President Kennedy in Dallas. And they're going to try to lay the blame at the feet of a pro-Castro communist who had tried to go to Cuba or did go to Cuba 2 months before the assassination, who met with an assassination expert 2 months before the assassination, and then came back assassinated. Now he's fled the country. And the only way to get justice is to invade Cuba, take out Castro, find the assassin, and oh, by the way, while you're there, install a new government in Cuba, an American-friendly government in Cuba. This is a false flag. It's all about creating a pretext for war. And so this Mexico City story is part of that pretext. Now, there's also the simultaneous effect, which is to hide something. They want this Mexico City to provoke us into declaring war against Cuba, but they also want to hide something. There's something going on because of Oswald's presence in Mexico City that they don't want the Warren Commission to touch with a 10-foot pole. Okay, when we get to the Medical Manhattan Project, I'll tell you all about it. So I promise. And so simultaneously, they want to provide this evidence to the Warren Commission. He went to Mexico City and met with Soviet Cuban officials and all that. That's going to get us in this war with Cuba, but they don't want them to look any closer at it because they want the Warren Commission to just trust the CIA and the FBI by extension that trust us. Oswald was acting on instructions from Russia. And the upshot of this is if you don't let us, if you don't believe this story, if you think it's not true, or if you, let me put it this way, if you investigate Oswald too closely, we don't want you to do this because if you investigate Oswald too closely, it's going to lead to you finding out Oswald's ties to the CIA and the real reason he was in Mexico City. You know, one of the things LBJ used to bully Earl Warren into serving on the Warren Commission was this idea that if this story gets out of control and too many people are investigating the assassination, it might lead the American people to conclude that Russia was behind this and we could cause a war, a nuclear war between two nuclear powers. 45 million people would die. And he lays that responsibility at Earl Warren's feet and basically says, do you want to be responsible for 45 million people dying just because you don't want to serve on the commission? So Warren kind of gets bullied into it. Here they are again saying, okay, we know based on this trip that he took to Mexico City, we know that Oswald was acting on instructions from Russia. We don't want to go to war, though, with Russia. And we don't want the American people to know anything about the Russian connection because that would mean war. We do want the American people to know about the Cuban connection because we're not afraid to go to war with Cuba. We would like to go to war with Cuba. And so this is all about steering the Warren Commission in a direction where they'll accept the CIA and FBI story that he went to Mexico City, that he was acting on behalf of the Cuban government to assassinate the president. And that's where he's trying to flee after the assassination. But they don't want the Russian connection to come out because they're afraid they don't want the American people to get stirred up into a war with Russia. That would mean too many people would die. They are prepared to go to war against Cuba, not Russia. And so they kind of simultaneously want two things at the same time. They want the investigation to nail Oswald for going to Mexico City for the purposes of planning the assassination and providing a place for him to run away to afterwards. But they don't want any Russian connections to come out because that would mean war, just war with Cuba. That's what we want. That's what this whole thing's about to begin with. We weren't looking for a war necessarily with Russia. We were looking for a war with Cuba. And so that is the point of this story. And that's why the CIA ran with it to begin with. And that's why the FBI got on board and started pushing it and trying to get Fenella Farrington to say, oh yeah, I met with Oswald. I knew him. We were down in Mexico City at first, and then I met him again in New Orleans later. I knew this guy. To have a witness, a live witness who said, yes, he was in New Mexico City. So the next thing that we start to see in the 2 months afterwards are Oswald sightings all over Dallas. And some of these, it's like someone's trying too hard to incriminate and lay a trail to Oswald. Some of these doppelgangers are in 2 or 3 places at the same time, and they're doing it too many times, and it's becoming obvious that someone is moving. There is a double down there who is running around posing as Oswald, signing his name, just like at the Mexico City embassy, and trying to lay a trail that people, witnesses, regular people who run into this guy, the occurrences are going to be so odd and so memorable that after the assassination, his picture comes up, people go, oh yeah, I ran into him. He did this, he said that. And it's going to paint this picture, and they're going to put it together and drop it in the cover story that Oswald is guilty, and he was busy in the 2 months prior to the assassination preparing for it. And now we know who these people, what these people are. They're all doppelgangers. They're all doubles, because Oswald cannot be 2 places. The real Oswald cannot be 2 places at once. And yet these people are. So that's where we're headed next. In episode 22, we're going to begin talking about some of these doppelgangers. And I mean, it starts several years before, as Oswald is, it actually starts while he's in Russia. Someone's using his name to buy trucks and weapons and things for the Cuban cause here in New Orleans. And J. Edgar Hoover's like, wait a second, who's this Oswald character who's using Oswald's name to buy these trucks and things, while the real Oswald we know is in Russia. So it starts then, way back when Oswald was in Russia, and it continues all the way up until the time Oswald is arrested, and even thereafter, shortly thereafter. So got a lot of ground to cover there. But I hope that this Mexico City story shows you that this is all about Oswald's last assignment. He is being prepped the entire summer of '63 for his real mission. He thinks it's to deliver to help develop the bioweapon in the labs in New Orleans, and then to deliver it to Cuba to assassinate Castro. But then he's reassigned, and he's given some cock and bull story about why he can't go to Cuba at the last minute, and they reassign him to Dallas. He arrives in Dallas on October 3. You see how closely thereafter these dates are to his alleged, according to the CIA, trip to Mexico City, which was September 27, 28. So October 3, less than a week later, he's reassigned to Dallas. By October 16th, his new handler, Ruth Payne, has gotten him a job at the Texas School Book Depository, October 16th. So 13 days after he gets back to Dallas. And then 1 month and 6 days later, here comes Kennedy for the famous motorcade. And of course, they changed the route of the motorcade at the last minute to take a jog down Houston Street and onto Elm Street, right in front of Oswald's building, Texas School Book Depository. And then, so that's the date that he needs to be in place for the assassination of the target. And then it culminates, the whole mission culminates 2 days later with Ruby killing Oswald on November 24th. So that's the real purpose of all this maneuvering that we've been talking about for the last 7 or 8 episodes of Oswald in New Orleans in that summer of '63. So where does the cover story stand presently? Well, they will have established the fact that he's a lonely nut. They're going to say, somebody said in the comment, why are you calling him a lone nut? He's not a lone nut. Well, I'm not calling him a lone nut. I'm disagreeing with that. It was the government that said he was a lone nut. Every media story somehow worked that into their story. He's a lonely nut. And they talked about his orphan background and stuff. And he was a trained sharpshooter. We talked about how that wasn't true. He studied the Russian language, so he must be a communist, right? He said he was a Marxist-Leninist. He went to Russia. Well, he did study the Russian language, and he did pretend to be a communist, but not for the reasons the government wanted people to realize. He defected to Russia. He must be a communist. He must hate America. Well, he did go to Russia, but again, not for the reasons that they want to say. He tried to renounce his U.S. citizenship. He did try to renounce it. He didn't go through with it, which tells you the whole thing was fake. He threatened to give up military secrets. He more than did that. He actually did give up military secrets, which is interesting. You know, this is the height of the Cold War. You give up military secrets, they'll execute you for that. That's treason. Ask Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, right? He married a Russian woman. But, you know, going back to the, you know, execution, nothing happened to Oswald. He came back after giving up the military secrets or threatening that you'd figure they'd want to at least investigate and see if he did, if this was an honest defection. They didn't even ask him about it. There's no repercussions at all. And we talked about why that was. Bobby Kennedy let him back in so he'd be an informant for the FBI against the CIA. He married a Russian woman. Well, that means he hates American women, I guess. He loves communism. Well, he did marry a Russian woman. We talked about how that got worked out. That was arranged by the KGB. He acted pro-Castro. He pretended to be a Marxist-Leninist. That's true. He did. It's part of the sheep dipping. He tried to go to Cuba and the Soviet Union by way of Mexico City. Okay, we just covered that. And of course, the CIA story about the Mexico City angle is completely false. And the FBI doubled down on that false story. But now I believe, and I hope to support that later in a later episode, that he did go to Mexico City. And he did try to go to Cuba. He wasn't trying to go to the Soviet Union. He was trying to go to Cuba, but for not the reasons that we're told. Completely different reason. A reason that the American government does not want to get out. The cover story includes, hey, he had opportunity. He was in the building where the shots came from, allegedly. Right? He was a Texas School Book Depository employee. That doesn't prove anything, but it does give him the opportunity, right? If the shots came from there. His guns killed Tippit and JFK. That's part of the cover story. Well, we now know that he didn't fire a rifle that day. You know, but the public doesn't know that at the time this cover story is being released. They don't know anything about the paraffin test. And of course, whether his guns killed Tippit or JFK, you know, that's going to be, you know, that's going to have to come out as a result of an investigation and a trial. Now, the American people are being told when they held up the Mannlicher Carcano and they find out he's a sharpshooter and they find out that the gun was found allegedly on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and they find receipts in his living quarters that he bought these guns. It's gonna make it look pretty damning, even though there's no fingerprints on the rifle. That they find out the rifle, the scope was defective. The Tippit shooting had bullets that didn't come from the 38 that Oswald had. I mean, there's just so much evidence that if there had been a trial, you couldn't even tie the guns to it, to these killings. But there's not going to be a trial. So this is a cover story. And again, you don't have to prove a cover story. Just release it. The American people, based on what they know, and they only know what they're told. And part of the cover story is that they found a palm print on the gun. We talked about how that happened. And then this doppelganger, the trail of evidence that these doppelgangers are going to lay, is just going to be like the nail in the coffin for him. It's just going to add to it. It's more evidence to add to this overwhelming cover story that paints a very bleak picture for Lee Harvey Oswald. But the public doesn't know these people are doppelgangers. They won't know that for years. Okay, we know it now, but they didn't know it then. The bottom line is the cover story never had to be true. There's not going to be a trial. They can't afford for there to be a trial. He was supposed to be killed when he was arrested. That didn't happen. Remember, I am not resisting arrest. I am not resisting. But he was never going to live to see a trial. That was clear. So all you got to have is a cover story that looks very bad. And it does. And you talk about a nail in the coffin. It's this photograph here that appeared on Life magazine cover. This is still, to this day, The issue of Life magazine that sold the most copies of any, it was a popular magazine back in those days. And this is the one that sold the most copies. And it portrayed, I mean, here he is holding the gun that allegedly killed the president. He's got on his hip the 38 that allegedly killed the cop. He's holding communist literature. He's posing for this in his backyard as if he's preparing for his mission in life, like he wants notoriety for what he's about to do, which is interesting because if he wanted notoriety for what he was about to do, why didn't he claim it? After the assassination, he had plenty of time in the Dallas Police Department headquarters being shepherded up and down the hallways. Why didn't he just tell the media, yeah, I did it. My name's Lee Harvey Oswald. Look it up. But he never did. In fact, he said, I'm just a patsy. Indeed, he was. Okay. Check out my website if you care to. Also, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. So every time I drop a new bit of content, you'll be made aware, and give me a thumbs up, and feel free to keep commenting. If there's anything you can add to this discussion, put it in the comment section and help stimulate a dialogue. Thank you. Have a good day.